Hello, everyone. I'm really excited today to have the opportunity to speak with Gabriel Ettenson. Welcome, Gabriel. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity yourself and for being here. And just a little bit of background. I have had the pleasure of meeting and working with Gabriel personally over the last, I think, 6+ months now, maybe even longer. And part of that is because I have unfortunately been plagued with chronic pain, neck and back pain over the years. And I've been on a journey to live with this pain. And part of that again, I was introduced from my physical therapist to Gabriel for a treatment that I refer to as light and sound therapy. And with that being said, it has been life-changing for me, not just the light and sound therapy that Gabriel has worked with me on, but some of the other modalities and treatments as well. And with that, I'd love just to turn it over to you, Gabriel, to kind of give some background on yourself, your company and what you're doing.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I am technically a licensed physical therapist in the state of Colorado, but I think if people were describing me, they'd probably describe the work I do as more sort of the alternative or complementary medicine space with a heavy emphasis on sensory technologies, which include predominantly light and sound. Also, I do work with aroma as well. And my background for many years was as a physical therapist. I was in New York City, and following at the time sort of the very, structured guidelines that a good physical therapist follows, especially when you're dealing with, very high profile orthopedic surgeons. And what I found was that because I needed to conform to the requirements of those doctors, my early years, I was very focused on sort of local treatment. So, for example, if someone had a knee issue, I would get a prescription for therapy, and they would tell me that I should work within this very confined area of the body, which was the knee, and that was where I was going to, have the greatest impact. But what I realized is that a lot of the time, when you actually do a full examination of someone with a knee injury or a shoulder injury or a neck or back injury, you would always see that there were other parts of the body that were also not moving correctly or had some history of some sort of physical trauma. And the reality was that, you couldn't fix an area of the body if you didn't look at it as sort of a holistic organism. And so I started to work on people, in that way. So if they had a knee issue, but I noticed their ankle wasn't moving, I would work on their ankle. And unfortunately, a lot of doctors didn't like this because it sort of undercut their professional sort of intelligence when it came to the body. But it was the only way forward. So I took my chance and I continued to work in that fashion. But then what happened next, especially with large sort of athletic populations, was I started to realize that a lot of people, especially when they were in pain, the more that they fixated on the way that that pain would impact their life and their ability to participate in all the things that they wanted to participate in, to work in the way they wanted to work, to hang out with their children and their family members. The more that they focused on that, the harder it was to get them out of pain. And so it started becoming very clear that it wasn't just about looking at the entire body when it came to a specific injury, but it was also important to sort of step a little bit outside of the physical therapist realm and think about sort of their mental state and the way that their anxiety over an injury was actually having an additional sort of physiological and physical impact on their healing process. And so, not trying to be a psychotherapist, I made the decision to start teaching meditation because I knew that if you really looked at the research on meditation, it wasn't this Eastern mystical practice, but it was something that actually had a lot of research, in particular brain research. And because I could connect the brain research to the meditation techniques, I was able to bring this to people that were more Western minded and convince them that it was something that they should at least take a shot at. And many of them did, and not surprisingly, as they continued to commit themselves to meditation, and we eventually brought in the mindfulness-based stress reduction program and Vedic meditation teachers, we started to make this a big emphasis. We started to realize that if we could get them into a quieter place psychologically or mentally, their injury recovery was going to likely occur at a much more rapid pace. And it wasn't just that they were feeling better and they were out of pain, but they actually started to feel as if it was impacting their experience in life. And so this whole idea of mind-body connectivity and its importance when you're in a medical structure that's separating everything needed to be prioritized. And basically, that's how I started to get interested in complementary and alternative medicine, and have put a lot of my focus there, while developing my business in Colorado, which I moved out here about 10 years ago.
That's amazing and fascinating. The mind-body connection, right? We hear that people talk about the mind-body connection, but what I'm hearing you say is ultimately there is a real physical connection, right? And a neurological connection that much of the pain and the pain sensories that are coming out of the brain, what you're talking about, I believe, is sort of calming and controlling and reprogramming some of those pain receptors in a way. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, chronic pain is a tremendous issue right now. If you really stop to think about it, there are billions of dollars that are going into research and product development and medical treatments. And yet, year after year, statistically, it seems to be getting worse. And so we're missing something. And where a lot of the Western research is going is to the central nervous system, and in particular the brain, sort of the more operational element of the central nervous system, and looking at not just the neurons in the brain, but other cells called glial cells, which are unfortunately for 100 years have been thought to be these kind of support cells that just kind of float around, and the neurons do all the work. But now, of course, things are flipping around and saying, well, they're actually largely responsible for controlling the mechanics of neurons. But the point is to say that in many cases, when you boil down everything from clinical depression to chronic pain to a number of other mental or physical health things that are typically siloed, like, you find this fundamental relationship between the way that the brain is operating and sort of the dedicated circuitry that seems to be commonly shared when people are dealing with these conditions. And so brain is technically part of the body, and in many ways different from sort of the general concept of the mind. But for many people, the use of the word mind and brain is interchangeable. So a lot of what we're doing in our business is really about changing both the body and the brain. And there's a lot of reason why there not just needs to be more of a focus on the brain, but there needs to be a better understanding that what we know about the brain is quite infantile compared to the reality of it. And, again, a lot of the work that we're doing is sort of balancing the idea of being very practical, very theoretical, very scientific, and acknowledging the body and the brain as it's currently known, but also doing everything we can to educate people on the signposts of a lot of the existing research, which describes the brain as doing things quite differently than most people think. And it's our belief that if we can get people to understand that, it'll give them a better understanding of how they can sort of change the way they experience their body, their brain, and really life.
So with that being said, we've talked a little bit about pain, but you also touched on mental illness and trauma, or PTSD in a way where I touch on how the different modalities and treatments that you work with can have an impact on changing the neural pathways in the brain. Because I know you've talked to me about that a fair amount of reprogramming how we view the world through
Yeah,
some of the work that you do.
it's a good question, and it's one of my favorite questions. But it's also you have to be very careful how you answer it because historically it's where people tend to check out. But the bottom line is this: Western medicine acknowledges that we have body parts. It acknowledges that those body parts are composed of tissues. It acknowledges that those tissues are comprised of cells. And then it tends to start to disconnect as we move into the fundamental components of cells, which are molecules. But of course, it doesn't fully disconnect because pharmaceuticals are largely based on the molecular layer of the body. But if you go one step further, and it's not going into some mystical realm, it's just going into a place that Western medicine doesn't like to go, but is largely one of the most scientifically supported areas of the human body. It's kind of the level of the atom. And the reason that the atom is so important is because it fundamentally contains information which is largely represented as particular vibrational characteristics. I mean, this is the reality of atoms, is that everything they do is largely based upon their vibrational characteristics. And they are the building blocks of the molecules. The molecules are the building blocks of the cells of the tissues. So while we like to layer it out and look at it as kind of like these individual structures, the reality is that like at the root of everything is information, and the nervous system is kind of the macroscopic, tangible, palpable representation of information system in the body. So if it's trauma, if it's physical injury, if it's, you know, anything at all that disrupts or shifts the information system, whether it's at the level of the atom or all the way up to the nervous system, it changes the way that we perceive the world. And the more that the world sort of feeds back to us a representation of that information, the brain essentially becomes very hardwired, very structured, very rigid, and then you get stuck in this very efficient loop of information. The brain doesn't care if you like the experience you're having or you dislike it. All it cares about is that it can process the incredibly sort of incomprehensible amount of information that it needs to process on a moment to moment basis. All it cares about is figuring out how to do that more efficiently. And if your experience in life is such that you're unhappy or that everything you see is making you feel these kind of negative feelings, the brain will perfect that model. So that's where a lot of the work that we do comes in. So we say we work with sound and light. A lot of times people immediately kind of roll their eyes, like, oh, you shine a light on me or something like that. But the important thing to understand is that sound and light are both different forms of energy, and that energy source contains with it specific information. And what type of information is it? It's vibration information. So when we identify that someone has a situation where they're stuck, whether they're stuck in their body with pain or stuck in their mind with depression, or they may be stuck in a relationship or stuck in a job they dislike. There's so many ways people get stuck. We look at that and we understand that that stuckness has its own physical and physiological representation in the brain, and largely in the neurological sort of circuitry of the brain. And then we take information in the form of sound and light, and we expose our clients to programs based on those particular forms of information, with the idea that the more we bring new information into the system, the more the brain integrates that information and begins to allow a different sort of circuitry to take place. And that work is always sort of adjacent to very intentional, very sort of goal-directed ideas of what the person wants to see happen, and really working with them to kind of distill that down and give them a focal point. that they can think about in between sessions. And so, it gets a little complicated, but it's real science. It was very common in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before everybody started saying, if you don't have research, it can't be real. But you don't have to look far to see it's all coming back around right now. Not just the work that we're doing, but there's a lot of advances happening with psychedelics. Psychedelics are now known through brain imaging to be these incredible neurological tools capable of very quickly adjusting the way people experience life. There's work being done with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is using electromagnetic fields to change the way that the nervous system is operating in people's brains. There's transcranial red light therapy now for Alzheimer's disease and other conditions. So it's taken 100 years to come back, but the reality is that the body fundamentally is an energetic system. It relies upon information, and these tools are very powerful and potent forms to change the information system and reorganize the brain. There's a
Fascinating.
lot.
It is a
Yeah.
lot, and it's all fascinating to me. And again, I can speak to it from personal experience and the extremely thought out, curated soundtracks that you put together that are in alignment with the light and the acoustical vibrations of the bed that you provide as well in your treatments. That, again, this is not one and done, right? I mean, you don't just come to you for one treatment and you're quote unquote cured or healed, right? But this is a process. And I think for me, that journey is also part of understanding that it's not just you go through therapy or you take a pill in life and you're healed and right, life is good. But this is about understanding once again the process that it has to go through. And I think one of the things that you said that I find fascinating is we're trying to digest and comprehend so much data and so much information that in our worlds today, we're on data overload. And part of what the efficiency of our mind is doing is creating these patterns, right? So that it helps us to say, oh, I've seen that, I've heard that, I've felt that, and react without thinking. And in a way, that actually serves us really, really well in life. But in my experience with you, there's also patterns that don't serve us well. And in some of the work that I've done with you, and maybe you can speak to this, how we identify certain patterns that say, hey, Gabe, that really serves you well. Like the easy example I can think of is, driving to the office in the morning, right? I can hop in the car and on autopilot, you just do it, right? You don't think about it. It's a pattern. But maybe there's another pattern of pain that every time you sit down in a certain chair, you feel that, my back. And that pattern that we sort of, again, create in our brains that we need to disrupt. So am I saying that properly?
Yeah, definitely. It's an acknowledgement for the fact that, again, the brain, its sole focus is improving efficiency, and it likes to be on autopilot. So if you have an injury and you develop pain, there's typically a healing process that happens. It's a highly complex, coordinated, sort of multi-system healing process. But when it starts to turn into chronic pain, it now becomes like a combination of physical, emotional, and cognitive. And so those different areas of the brain start to kind of connect through circuits. So the more that emotion contributes to physical pain, or cognitive, meaning thinking about things, the more difficult it is to stop feeling like you're in pain. So, like you said, you may identify a particular chair as sort of preventing you from healing initially. But once you get into chronic pain, right, just looking at that chair and saying, "Oh, like I really don't want to sit in that chair," which is a cognitive sort of process. And then, there's kind of like this frustration or anger, perhaps, that, you have to sit in the chair, and there's your emotional element, right? And so but that's all perceived as pain, physical pain, right? And so then you go to the doctor and you say, like, I can't get rid of this pain. And the doctor is you know, physical medicine doctor, and he says, well, go get an MRI. You go to your therapist, your psychotherapist, and they say, well, let's look at, kind of what happened to you like early on in life. So you have these people that are just like very focused on trying to improve this one third component of what causes chronic pain. And so you have to break that. And to do that, you have to really educate people, or use these tools that are not based in a specific theory. They're just simply highly efficient forms of energy, and they have different frequencies and different vibrational characteristics, and they interact directly with the brain. There's a theory out there called the autonomous brain, and it's a scientific theory, and it's basically saying, like, the brain uses the senses to perceive reality. It works towards efficiency. If it detects an error in its predictive efficiency, it adjusts itself, and then it begins to predict a different version of the world. And what you are is really sort of this element within the body that's just having the experience. And it's a cool theory because it touches on a lot of like very deep Eastern philosophical ideas of kind of like being consciousness. But it's also very heavily rooted in this idea that the brain and the environment are really kind of in a more direct conversation, and you're really more the person experiencing it. So it's shifting the way that the brain interacts with the environment that can shift your experience. And that includes being in less pain, feeling less depressed, feeling less anxious, feeling more content in a relationship, and so forth and so on. And that's really what we're doing, is we're trying to intervene in that more direct relationship between the brain and the external world so your experience can change.
Well, and part of that, as we get close to the end here, I find interesting around the concept of expanding your mind, right? When people think about or talk about psychedelics, I've heard people talk about expanding the mind. And you've talked a little bit about the idea that this is the reality. It's just a different type of reality, right? And it's your
Mm.
own mind. You're just put into a different state, if you will. I don't know if, again, I'm saying that properly, that allows you to more freely expand your mind. And then when you are in the traditional reality of living life and going through the motions, once you've had that experience, you can see the world a little differently. Am I, again, saying that properly?
Yeah. It's at the end of the day, like, it's a change in the belief system.
Okay.
So again, the brain, this is not to get too technical, but like a very big area of, it's called computational neuroscience, which is a highly advanced form of neuroscience focused on combining AI with computers, with mathematics. And so one of the biggest contributions that they've made is the understanding that, like, the brain isn't just interpreting information from the external world, it's then taking that information, almost like reversing it and projecting a version of the world that is most representative of what it understands. And so it gets a little bit kind of strange there, because it's sort of suggesting that, like, your brain is actually creating reality, and reality is not as fixed as you think it is. But science would tell you that that is 100% the case. And so, you know, becoming more spiritual, or expanding self-awareness, or better connecting with consciousness, these ultimately are nothing more than a different belief system. But for many people that do find ways to continue to develop a more expanded view of who they are, or their connectivity to other things, or a more intuitive understanding of the sort of play between pleasure and pain, bad and good, these kind of contrasted states that have to exist because they couldn't exist if their opposite didn't. Again, it begins to move someone towards a more intuitive experience. It feels more real. There's a much more direct experience that the more that they change, the world changes around them. And in general, as many research studies have shown, people tend to be healthier. They tend to be less reactive. They tend to be more content. They tend to be less dependent upon material pleasures as being an indication of success. They gain more present moment awareness. And I think that's the most that people can hope for. There will never be an end to pleasure and pain. That's part of life's experience, and why many people seeking only positive experiences often feel um, a lack of satisfaction in that pursuit. But it's that equanimity, it's that understanding that the brain builds according to efficiency and it will build both desirable and undesirable, and that sometimes the most desirable situations lead to the most undesirable outcomes and vice versa. So the best thing to do is to proceed forward with equanimity and not categorizing everything as good or bad. And again, more philosophical sort of conversation there, but it's still a large part of that support system that's happening while we're working with these technologies and different tools to help put the brain into a place where it's capable of being more moldable.
No, I love that. And you have taught me that. I will say that's, trying not to label things, right, as good or bad, as positive or negative. And the reality is, I love that you're saying you can't have one without the other, right? The pain versus pleasure. Because I think about folks that I know with anxiety or depression that are on medication, that it effectively reduces their senses in a way is the way I interpret it, right? So they don't have the highs and the lows. They sort of operate at a more neutral place in life, right? So that they reduce the potential for going to that really negative, really low place. And for them, that could be the absolute proper, medicine and situation, if you will. But what I love, again, what you're saying is you're never going to have one without the other, right? And as long as we acknowledge that, and that's okay, then you get to enjoy the highs and the good even more so. Because if we didn't have the
Mm-hmm.
bad or the lows, then you wouldn't have that positive sensation of the highs or the good. Again, am I saying that properly?
Yeah, equanimity is a kind of abstract concept, but it's another form of describing it might be being in flow,
In flow.
right?
Yeah.
And in flow means that you are connecting with the pleasure, you're connecting with the pain, but you appreciate the need to continue to work towards being fully immersed in them and then letting go of them. And that's really, people want to get out of pain and they want to stay in pleasure, and that's why many people are increasingly more discontent. Like, if you're gonna have pain or you're gonna have sadness or you're gonna have loss, go into it deeply, be with it, and then let go of it, to the best
Mhm.
of your abilities. If you're gonna be in a state of euphoria and pleasure and just absolute bliss, go all in on it and then let go of it. And that's really the key to maintaining this flow state. And like I said, that when you develop that flow state, you develop this position of equanimity, your brain will begin to build a world that reflects that flow. And I think ultimately that's what most people are looking for.
That's fascinating. Go with it, embrace it. And yeah, I think that's a great tip and a great way to potentially conclude for today. But with that being said, I know you do a lot more with your clients and patients, if you will, than just the light and the sound therapy and other modalities that you incorporate. I know you don't like the term coach, But I know you do some sort of, again, sort of integration, if you will, and coaching with your clients and patients. So with that being said, if someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out to you, Gabriel?
Yeah, well, we call ourselves facilitators, and that's just means we do everything we can to get people to connect to their own wisdom, right? That's the goal, to
Awesome.
facilitate that connection. SageSpaceRetreat.com, that's my website. Best way to reach me is probably through the website. My office is located within Performance and Recovery Labs. They also have a scheduling component on their website to reach me. Right in Central Boulder by the 29th Street Mall.
Awesome. This has been great. Again, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and really just appreciate this for sharing your
Yeah,
knowledge with
same
everyone.
here. Yeah, thank you, Gabe. I
All right.
appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Gabriel. Have a good one. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
See ya.